This is Swapnil Bharti, and we are here at the Spinnaker Summit in Seattle. Today we have with us Andy Glover, who is the, should I call you father of Spinnaker?
No. My team did all the hard work.
So what do you do at Netflix?
What is it that you do here? I'm the director of delivery engineering. We are charged with, enabling Netflix's competitive advantage of speed through continuous delivery. So we essentially own and operate Spinnaker at Netflix, and Spinnaker is well known as a continuous delivery platform to AWS, but Netflix has more than one environment. So obviously we leverage AWS, but we also have our own container cloud called Titus, and then we also have probably the largest CDN, or second largest, let's say. I think actually YouTube is larger than us, which is called our OpenConnect, or which is called OpenConnect. And so Spinnaker is also delivering firmware to that. So we do have a multi-cloud environment at Netflix. And again, that's what my team does, is listen to those stakeholders, understand their use cases, and ensure that they can develop, or they can deliver or affect code delivery rapid, reliably, safely, securely.
Excellent. And as during your keynote yesterday, you were saying that now it's like official summit, because you're in a hotel finally.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the evolution of Spinnaker in these 3 years?
Yeah. Well, so it really is special that we are here, in Seattle at the Motif, having this conference. The evolution of Spinnaker over the last 3 years it's been a roller coaster ride. It's been amazing. People have asked me, during this conference, did you ever imagine, we all be hanging out here in Seattle? And the answer is no, not in my wildest dreams. We ultimately set out in the beginning to replace Asgard, which was essentially a glorified AWS console that affected or allowed you to do deployments. And it was very clear that Netflix needed a single, or at least a centrally managed continuous delivery platform that could serve the needs across various engineering teams at Netflix, but also enabled pluggability so that we could go beyond AWS and look at our OpenConnect appliances, look at something like Titus. Anyways, so we set out to build this flexible platform, and through a kind of chance discussion with some folks at Google, who at the time I believe were looking to fork Asgard and make it work on our Google Cloud platform, and somehow we were able to convince them that, why don't you join us in building this thing called Spinnaker. We want it to be pluggable, and if you did it on Asgard, we wouldn't. And then, in fact, let me take a step back. The lesson learned from Asgard is that it was forked by IBM. IBM forked it twice, once for SoftLayer, and then once to make it work with Docker. And those forks were fascinating because they changed it in subtle ways. In particular, making Asgard work with Docker was eye-opening, because at the time Netflix was looking at, well, what's this container story and what do we do with it? And here's this, divergent fork that we can't leverage because it's so much different than the mainline Asgard. So that being said, we set out to build Spinnaker to be flexible. Chance encounter with Google, another encounter with good folks at Pivotal, and lo and behold, we had validated this idea that if we build this continuous delivery platform in cooperation with other vendors, we can come out with a platform that is not just for Netflix, but for others. So it's been a fascinating journey. Microsoft came on board. Eventually Oracle came on board. Folks at Cerner added DCOS support. Google expanded their support from just the compute platform to Kubernetes, App Engine. I'm probably missing someone in there. So it's been an amazing journey, and then culminating, or not culminating, but at least the journey continuing in the last 6 months. AWS is now participating in the project. They today announced they're going to be upstreaming some Lambda support. They demoed Fargate support, and then they have the ability for you to spin up Spinnaker on EKS. So it just continues to get more and more exciting.
Right. And then you see all those users here. Of course, you interact with them. You don't have to come to the event. So, what kind of use cases or trends are seeing which amazed you?
Yeah. I think amazed is, when I think about multi-cloud from a Netflix standpoint, we look at multi-cloud from the standpoint of there's AWS, and then there's Titus, which runs on top of AWS, and then there's, for example, our Open Connect appliances, or OCAs. I've talked to a number of companies that are leveraging both GCP and Amazon, and have data centers, and then are putting Kubernetes in those data centers, and then being able to say, okay, now we have one single platform that can affect delivery to both our data centers, or to our data centers and the cloud. And I suspect eventually they'll migrate away from the data centers. And so this time last year, the multi-cloud story was kind of limited to Waze. They're the poster child for both using AWS and GCP. But at this conference, I feel like every big company I talk to is doing the same thing. So that's definitely been amazing for me, because a lot of the questions I've fielded throughout the year, or ever since we built Spinnaker really, or released it open source, is who's doing multi-cloud and why? And so a number of the conversations I had at this conference, why are you doing multi-cloud? And I think it boils down to just risk assessment. People don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, and that's not surprising. I think there's a lot of complexity in doing multi-cloud, but apparently it's not as complex as I would imagine, because again, I talked to Snapchat, or Snap, makers of Snapchat, and their multi-cloud. I talked to Cerner. So yeah, a number of big companies are doing multi-cloud, and I think Spinnaker is enabling them to do it easily.
So because you are in a unique position, because you have seen Spinnaker from Asgard days, and its birth, but now suddenly you're seeing people, embracing and adopting in the use cases you did not envision back then. So we have seen some open source projects that made the mistake. I don't want to name them, and they learned some lessons. So how, like Kubernetes is a good example, where they have very tight focus. They are more about, no, we don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do that. So how do you plan to ensure, or at this stage, do you even care about it, that where users may take it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, we struggle with it internally at Netflix. How do we ensure that Spinnaker doesn't become bloated or fall apart on itself, or a kitchen sink? I haven't seen indications from the community, the open source community, that we're headed in that direction. Most, if all of the major innovations that we've seen has been from the standpoint of what are we deploying to, which makes a lot of sense, and then new stages, and then taking advantage of particular, let's say, features within a cloud, so to speak, like Lambda support or Fargate. So at this point, I'm not necessarily concerned that the open source community could take Spinnaker in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of the things we've done in Netflix that I'm not hearing the open source community talk about, and so this is probably something we need to kind of debate. For example, at Netflix, we're doing library delivery with Spinnaker. So there are a number of teams at Netflix that don't necessarily produce a service, but they produce basically a jar file that then maybe you as a service owner would then import, for your particular application. So these are shared jars, utilities, so to speak. And those teams leverage Spinnaker to deliver those libraries and test and ensure that those libraries don't break, end users, so to speak. And I'm not aware of other people within the open source community doing that yet with Spinnaker. So it'll be interesting to see kind of if people follow that model, or if they see it as it doesn't make a lot of sense. Although it's hard for me not to see how that does not make sense with respect to continuous delivery. I think another thing that we've done at Netflix that I'm not seeing yet talked about, or at least implemented in the open source world, is we affect data with Spinnaker at Netflix. So we have this service called Fast Properties, and you can think of it like feature flags. For example, when season 3 of Stranger Things comes out, someone will flip a bit and it'll light up the globe with season 3, right? And they'll do that via changing some property from false to true is live. And over the years at Netflix, we have seen that, let's say, changing data is pretty dangerous, or it can be very dangerous, especially from a global standpoint. For example, I may accidentally flip the bit from false to true for is season 3 of Live early. And that could be a bad thing, especially if we were contracted in some contractual basis not to, let's say, release this content until this date. And so with Spinnaker, you can create a pipeline to ultimately roll out a property in a staged manner and validate it between each stage. So a typical rollout, let's say, of a global affecting property is to go to one region, flip it to true or false, whatever it may be, or whatever the data is, and validate you hadn't really broken production, and then do another region, and then do another region. So that's all done via Spinnaker. And it makes a whole lot of sense because it is, again, affecting delivery in a secure, safe, reliable manner. It just, in this case, isn't a VM or a Docker container, but it's just it's data.
So does that mean you have seen the season 3 already?
No, but
Can you personally stream it to your own account? Flip the switch just make a little backdoor in Spinnaker and flip the switch for your own account.
No, it's funny because a very large bank is using Spinnaker, and I just happen to have a mortgage with that bank, and so I keep kind of making these same jokes. Is there something you guys can do to help me out here? If I put some sort of flag inside of Spinnaker, does it mean I have to pay my mortgage anymore? But in all seriousness, no.
Okay, so all these internal use cases that you have, how do you plan to bring it to the community so they can also benefit from those use cases?
So some of the challenges we have at Netflix, and I recognize that other companies have these same challenges, is that the systems that we integrate with, that my team integrates with themselves, may not be open source. So in the case of library management per se, we're integrating with another system that is not open source. And so it creates a challenge for us to roll, obviously, that solution out in the open source community. So it goes back to us ensuring that Spinnaker is a platform so that we can effectively move fast at Netflix and integrate with other systems and not have, or be encumbered by the fact that, like, well, because we're open source and they're not open source, we have to do some, wrangling. In this case, we don't have to because we've done this a number of times. And so from the open source standpoint, I think showing that these are some of the innovations we're doing at Netflix, like integrating with our fast property service, integrating with our dependency management service, other enterprises likely have similar systems, and they can kind of model how we've done it, and they don't necessarily have to open source it. So I think the answer really is that from a priority standpoint is ensuring that we put resources into making Spinnaker easy to extend and then showing how to extend it. And so, like I said, even though we can't necessarily, in fact, the fast property service that we do integrate with is open source. It's called Arceus. It's slightly different than the internal Netflix fast properties, but arguably someone could take that and run with it in the open source world. The library management service I'm talking about, the dependency management service, is not open source, but I think it's easy enough to kind of look and see how we did it, and someone could replicate it on the other end as well.
Something interesting that I was just thinking right now was that open source has kind of created this amazing world where all these earlier you would not expect Kubernetes and all those things to come out at all, and now suddenly you have these amazing technologies that are being developed at a company like Netflix, and you're open sourcing it and everybody can benefit from it.
Yeah, isn't that awesome?
Yeah, it is. It's amazing, but at the same time, what does Netflix get in return?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked. It's been asked a number of times. Netflix, or any company that open source, gets a lot of things, but I would say the number one benefit that we see at Netflix is innovation. So a great example is that Google, they are in the Spinnaker ecosystem. There's a team at Google adding amazing features to Spinnaker for meeting their use cases. And one of the use cases they had was they needed a authorization and authentication service in Spinnaker, because when we built Spinnaker at Netflix, we essentially had it wide open. because Netflix has a very open culture of freedom and responsibility. So you and I can go into Spinnaker and we can do whatever we need to do to get our job done, including deleting someone else's service. Not that anyone at Netflix would do that, but you have the power. Yeah, the notion is everyone at Netflix has root to any machine in the cloud, which is true today. However, it turns out that not all companies embrace that. And in fact, a lot of companies have, let's say, environments or restrictions on, I can't touch this other service, whether it be for PCI or SOX compliance, which in fact Netflix has the same restrictions. And so Google added this service called Fiat, which adds auth-in, auth-z service on top of Spinnaker, within Spinnaker, I should say. And now at Netflix, we're leveraging that. And so previous to us bringing in Fiat, we have to run 2 separate Spinnakers, one for all of the employees at Netflix to do whatever they need to do within AWS and Titus and whatnot. But we have to run a separate Spinnaker that works in our PCI compliant environment, which we had locked down through a different means. And for example, I can't get to that because I shouldn't be affecting delivery in this environment, which is fine. But with Fiat, we are now able to not have to run 2 Spinnakers, but 1. And that auth-in, auth-z framework will still ensure that I can't go and do something in a PCI scoped application, but I still can touch other ones. That's one big example of, again, innovation that someone else wrote that Netflix didn't have to write. A much simpler use case is there's a webhook stage in Spinnaker. That was upstreamed from Schibsted, which is a European company. And I would say, some high percentage of pipelines within Netflix leverage the webhook stage to do things. It's the workhorse of pipelines, probably across the industry, those that are using Spinnaker. So that's innovation that, by open sourcing this platform, it wasn't even on our roadmap or probably even on my radar or anyone's radar to write a webhook stage, but all of a sudden one came in out of the dark, and now we're using it. So that's a win-win for everybody. And that's just 2 examples of
many examples.
Exactly.
Yeah, because sometimes a lot of companies, they open source, but they also commercialize it, in one way or other. But that is not the case with Netflix. I think you guys will just be making, amazing TV shows that we all love.
Yeah, I think we're far better at that.
Yeah. So that's why I say more, interesting to see, what do you get. And you're right, because no matter how, because I was talking to Hired yesterday, and they're like, Netflix is on the top, in the highest ranking or whatever it is called. But no matter what, you cannot hire the best people, the brightest mind in the world, But open source allows you to work with those people, to improve your product. Actually, the guy who's working on improving your code is getting paid by your competitor.
Sure.
That's how.
Well, and I think also the way, and again, we didn't set out to do this with Spinnaker, but there's a vibrant community around Spinnaker. We're all here, in Seattle. And what's beautiful about that is not only the innovation and the sharing of ideas, but for example, Google or Netflix or Apple or the other companies that are represented at this conference, from a hiring standpoint, like when you come to Netflix, if you came from a company that was using Spinnaker, you don't have to learn something new. Or vice versa, if you're at Snap and you go to Cerner, both companies are using Spinnaker, you don't have to learn some new custom at Cerner we do it this way with this other machinery and whatnot. And so by a large community, we are somewhat creating an industry standard, what makes it easy for people, new employees who come onto your company, to just embrace continuous delivery and start running as fast as possible, adding value, rather than spending, let's say, like a week in boot camp trying to learn how to use this delivery system versus that one.
Yeah, that's also open source has changed. Otherwise, earlier you had to go to standard bodies to build. Now open source, you create standards that become industry standard. You don't have to go to an ISO to get a standard. From your perspective, because as the project is growing, or the product is growing, and the community is growing, which one of these 3 is you are like, this is close to your heart?
Community. Yeah, because I firmly believe that as the community grows, the product and the project will grow with it. I'm firmly convinced of it. I think it's fairly obvious to everyone, and it's by no means limited to the Spinnaker, project. We've seen it with Kubernetes. We've seen it with previous projects. a vibrant community all, running towards the same goal, will create a better project, a better product. One of the things I'm very passionate about, and I think we've got a long way to go, but we've made some progress, is this idea of inclusion, right? And leveling the playing field so that anyone can get involved. I think, before we formalized the governance policy, I suspect there was not an intimidation factor, but when you looked at the Spinnaker project, you saw it as it's Netflix and Google. And I'm a small company and I have this little need and I don't know how to get kind of a seat at the table so I can convince these two giant heavyweights to meet my needs. When in fact, we would probably be very, very interested in hearing that, but there's this, this again, let's say intimidation factor or whatnot. And I know I can empathize with that because I have not always worked at Netflix. I was at small companies and dreamed of the day to sit at a table with Google and somehow convince them to use, something I was using. So I think by formalizing a governance policy and clarifying how you can affect change in the project is great, and will build a more inclusive, stronger community, then we'll build a better project and product.
So where do you see community in let's say 1 or 2 years? We cannot talk about 5 years anymore because things are changing so fast. So okay, let's say next summit, by next summit, where do you see? It's not about where do you want to see the community? Yeah,
well, I want to see it much bigger, much more vibrant. So I have numbers. So we have 40 committers today. I would love to see that number be way higher. I don't want to set a target because then I'm an engineer. I'll game it. So I would love to see it higher than it is today. I don't know what that is, but I have every expectation should be, how about much? That's fairly vague, but much higher. And I want it to be more diverse, right? More women, people of color, regardless, in that committer or approver list. I'd love to see more icons on the community list in terms of companies that are leveraging Spinnaker. I firmly believe that as more companies leverage this platform, some will give back to the community in some way. And it's not required. I can totally get that there are companies that leverage open source and just don't have the resources to give back, and that's fine. There's no expectation on the part of the Spinnaker community. But I know some portion of companies that leverage Spinnaker will either, hopefully submit a feature. But I know there's a high bar there. But maybe they'll submit an issue, and that's great. They may find a bug that we hadn't found yet. They may update the documentation and clarify something that we didn't think of, or see it in a different light. Heck, they could even fix grammar on the website. Whatever someone will do and give back to the community is great. And I know the only way to get there is to get more, more people, so to speak, or more people in the community, more passionate about where we're taking this thing.
I will come back to the diversity point, but before that, when I look at community, I may be wrong, is I see three players. One is the one who created the technology, then there is a vendor community, they commercialize it, and then there is user community.
Yeah.
So what kind of balance you want to see here?
Yeah, well, ideally a lot of users. How's that? Now, I think from a vendor standpoint, so so of the three,
am I right about three, or there can be more?
I think you're right. And the vendor and those that want to commercialize, they're somewhat blurry. That's fine. We can differentiate those two. I firmly believe we'll see the most innovation out of the former two, vendors and those that wish to commercialize products. Spinnaker itself, we're on top. End users, though, will, if anything, what we've learned over the last decade is that, developers are the kingmakers, right? Long gone are the days where, the sales guy went out and met with the CIO and had golf, and then the next day you had, or PeopleSoft, signed, and it was going to be implemented at your big giant company. The way it starts today is that developers, will find something that is appealing, start using it, it becomes sticky within a company, and then within a few months, everyone at the company is using it, but not because they were mandated, but they saw there's value, like it makes my job easier, or it saves me, this does something for me, and so I'm going to start using it. So those end users adopting Spinnaker will then grow the community, because then they'll bring it into company foo, and foo will begin to use Spinnaker and then start writing, let's say, extensions to make sure that it's integrated with their whatever audit system or something like that. So we'll still see innovations there as well. But again, the commercial vendors and or just the vendors and those in the commercial one are obviously very incentivized to innovate on top of the platform to make value-added things that will then bring those users to it. And I think the other thing that's interesting that we kind of struggled with in the beginning is there are vendors in the ecosystem that are trying to make money, which is great. I firmly believe in capitalism. But what we kind of struggled with as a community is, well, they're building stuff, but they're not open sourcing it. And in fact, I think that's fine, because it took me a couple conversations to realize that, in fact, at Netflix, we're doing similar things in that we are building stuff on top of Spinnaker that is not open source, like we talked about earlier. It's not because we're licensing it or anything like that. It's just that for whatever reason, the system we're working on is not open sourceable because it's does something unique. And so that's why we built this platform, so that you can innovate on top of it, and you can do it in such a manner that you're not required to open source those things that, let's say, plug into Spinnaker. So building an ecosystem on top of Spinnaker and adding some sort of value and attempting to make a business on that, I think is phenomenal. And what we've seen is that there is a need for it. There's more than one company trying to create, let's say, a business on top of Spinnaker, and I think it's a sign of a healthy ecosystem and a healthy project. And so I think as a community, we should encourage it, and we do it. It took a little while to figure it out, but now people recognize, hey, these vendors they're giving back in some way. There's some stuff they're holding proprietary, and that's fine. They're adding value here and there, but they're also giving back where they see appropriate.
Yeah, I'm a very staunch supporter of open source. I have been an open source advocate also, but over time, I also realized that sometimes when you talk about open source, we get stuck in code so much, we forget about the ecosystem. So I use analogy of farming. You are in a field growing potatoes, Okay, everybody can go to the field and grow potatoes, but you need transportation companies, who will transport that. You need restaurant chains. You need DoorDash, who will deliver food to my room.
You need fertilizer.
You need fertilizer. You need, Uncle Chips to, burn to. So you need the whole, ecosystem around it, and not all of them will be in the field digging potatoes. So same thing I see with open source. There are, players who will work on the code, but there will be a whole big ecosystem, because, okay, you create an open source project, okay, I got it. What about the day two?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and
I have matured in a way that I don't think about open source just all those, companies who are building, business around it. Somehow, either you pay through code or through currency, So you are paying a developer who is, working on that code. So.
Well, and I think also the ecosystem is big enough where there's room for people to play in. Like you said, farming is not just the farmer who's digging up the potato. Case in point with Spinnaker, when we open sourced it, we, Netflix and Google, we did not necessarily prioritize making Spinnaker easy to install. Definitely an oversight on our part. And as a community, we're still making it easier to install. But there was an opportunity for, again, a vendor to come along and say, here's a packaged version of Spinnaker. And I still believe that, so for example, at Netflix, my team, we operate Spinnaker. And when there's a problem or there's a question, people come to us for support. And that's a service we provide to Netflix. I can totally see that at some companies, they would want to pay someone for that support. Essentially, the proverbial, they need a neck to choke when something breaks, and I get it. And that use case is played out, in a number of different projects throughout, our careers.
Right. So like we have seen this Kubernetes community, there are so many vendors who are, repackaging Kubernetes distribution. Do you want to see that world where people have the choice of build versus buy, depending on their use case? So
I think so. I think we need that.
That's it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please go ahead.
I was just saying, I was going to agree. I have nothing more to add other than I think we need it.
Right.
I've heard it from the community, people asking me directly, who can we essentially hire to, get Spinnaker up and running in our company, who can, run it for us, who can, help transformed into a DevOps culture. I mean, there's all these opportunities in the ecosystem that, again, Netflix, we're really good at making content, and that's what we do best, and that's what we will do. We open sourced a platform. We hope people can innovate and build something on top of it, and some of it will, we'll be able to, reap the benefits and use at Netflix, and vice versa. There's innovations we're doing at Netflix that we're putting into the platform that then others can take advantage of.
Yeah, but one thing with open source that is also critical is, yes, we would like more people to open source their code. That's for true. But sustainability and health.
Yep.
How do you? Spinnaker is not that new, but it's relatively new. The community is growing. How do you plan to ensure that it is sustainable and it will remain healthy?
Yeah. Well, I think the governance, starting down the governance route, is the first step there. We obviously came out of the gate without a governance policy, and it was very much a, for lack of a better word, gentleman's agreement between, between Netflix and Google. And that scaled for the first few years. Steven, my colleague at Google, and I noticed probably about a year ago that things were kind of growing beyond our ability to effectively manage it. Previous to that, it was, and you've seen it, at this conference, it's very much relationship based. I know them, Steven knew them, and them, and them. And so we had it covered. And we had a very open, transparent community where everyone, where we encouraged everyone, like, why are you here? What are your incentives? Why are you motivated to be in this community? What are you trying to get out of this? And that was very important for us to establish trust among the groups. Like when a vendor came, okay, it's clear you're trying to make money. And I made it very clear that as Netflix, I'm going to work in Netflix's best interest. And we may disagree, but at least we know where we're coming from so that, when conflict arises, we can work through it. Anyways, about a year ago, we recognized that there were more and more people / companies, how about entities, synonymous things, that were voicing opinions, coming into discussions that we were unaware of. And it was becoming difficult for us to manage that. It's a scale thing. And so, to your question about how we ensure a healthy community going forward is, again, leveling the playing field and opening it up and saying, hey, there's a new company, knocking at the gate, let's let them in and figure out how we can do this in a fair, unbiased manner. And I think another way to keep the community healthy is to do events like this, get us together and start discussing. I think, at every conference, the best part is the hallway track, and some of the conversations I've had have just been amazing, eye-opening, and I suspect I'm not the only one who's had those. Obviously, the sessions themselves have been amazing to see how people are innovating and what new ideas people are coming up with. And I think ultimately to keep this community healthy is to have, a humble attitude. At Netflix, we do things our way, but it doesn't mean we're not open to learning how other people are doing it. And this journey has been very much lesson in humility and saying, oh, well, this is how Google does it. This is how Shipstead does it. This is how GoGo Air, whatever, all these different companies. And they do it slightly differently, Capital One. And there are two ways of looking at it. Either like, you're doing it wrong, or, oh, that's really interesting. We don't do it that way, but I can understand why you do it that. And maybe if we did this slightly differently, we might actually be able to, gain that benefit that they're seeing. So I think that humbleness will enable us to be a healthy community that continues to grow and expand.
Now I'll come back to the diversity point that you made. Why is diversity important? Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, I think it matters from the standpoint of creating a healthy community, right, and different perspectives. I think across the industry, if you bring different people to the table, they will come with different perspectives. And I think that's ultimately builds it builds a better community, a stronger community. We have already seen from a company standpoint, corporate standpoint, corporations that embrace diversity are more successful, right? It's a global world at this point, right? Netflix is a global company. This project is a global project. It's not, unique to Silicon Valley white males per se. So I find that as we bring more diverse, people to the table, they bring, again, different perspectives that I think enable all of us to see things kind of differently, whether it be a different company or a different person, doesn't matter. Once you kind of see it from, through see things through their lens, it's mind-opening, let's say.
So how do you plan to ensure that the Spinnaker community is inclusive and diverse enough?
Well, I think there's a lot more we can do. I don't know if we're very good at it at this point. So obviously I keep coming back to the governance policy of making it so that it's very clear how you can become let's say a committer. And it's not, on the whims of me or Steven. I had a conversation with an individual who's very much interested in trying to increase diversity in open source, and she had a number of different suggestions that, again, were eye-opening for me in terms of the language we use within the community, in terms of documentation or how to get started can be exclusive. Even the conferences that we have. So in this conference, we tried to create this notion of a D&I scholarship. But even the way, I come to find out with some feedback from some great folks in the community that the wording was off, and it not so much that it scared people off, but it misled them to think that the application process wasn't open when indeed it was. So there's so many more things we can do to make this a more inclusive community. And I don't pretend to have all the answers right now, but I think ultimately, if as a community we embrace it and know that there's so much more we can be doing and we're open to feedback, I think is a great start.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, that how you may not be sensitive enough to understand. So when you bring those people, then they will bring that value with them. And that's a very good approach towards making a community really inclusive.
Yeah, in fact, a question I received right before the conference, and I didn't have an answer, was what do we do about do we have some program for childcare? And it didn't even cross my mind. I have 4 kids, but I'm fortunate in that my better half is able to watch them. But I totally recognize that there are people that don't have that option, and I feel terrible for not even having thought of it. And so next year, I think that's something we have to figure out. Is okay if coming to the conference, or if childcare or the inaccessibility of childcare is a reason for you not to be able to come to this conference, I think that's something we should look into to see how we could fix. That's just one example. There's probably a million of things we could do better.
Yeah, I was walking in the room when I was looking for you, and I saw a couple of kids. Actually, one of the events that I go to every year is LinuxCon.
Yeah.
And I started going to in 2009 before I was married, and then we got son. So I had been bringing my son, and Linus Torvalds, when he saw and he showed me his picture, hey, yeah, I saw your son. So he would be 2 years old, he'll be running in the conference, and it just changes the environment.
Yeah.
Because all of us, sometimes people say, oh, you're not very nice but when we go home, we have sisters, brothers, kids, we are not. So when you bring that, create that environment, we become what we are,
Yeah.
good, nice people, who love to talk to each other. So they have started this Next Foundation. They have started daycare at their event.
Yeah. Okay. That's great.
Yeah. So what happens is a lot of parents, they both work, so they now are able to come to the event. They drop their kids which sometimes happen to be the same venue. They just hire some nannies, and they watch them in the room. They have a lot of toys, and they play with them. And then the whole family's together. And then what they've also started doing is the final day, they organize a kids day.
Yeah.
Where somebody teaches kids how to code.
Yeah.
And all those HTML kind of thing. So I think that would be amazing for a Spinnaker community.
I agree.
To
Yeah.
bring. It won't be a lot of investment, but it will be amazing for the whole families to come together and be at the event.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you for bringing that up. I would love, next year to have that option. I think that would be incredible.
And there's nothing better, to bring the whole family together,
Yeah.
right? These events should bring families together.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's funny because yesterday an individual here, he did bring his family. He has 2 young children, and they were running around the exhibitor floor, and you can't help but smile, when you see kids. And so yeah,
Exactly.
even from that standpoint, yeah.
Suddenly, no matter what stress you have, my kid became so kind of regular that people now they're big. Hey, where is Adi? No, we don't bring him anymore because
he's got school.
Yeah, he has school. But now he's saying that, Daddy, I can come with you and help you with this stuff. He's 7 years old. I said, so maybe I'll start bringing him next year to help me with the cameras.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be so. We talked about technology a lot. Let's talk about you for a while. That when you're not secretly watching season 3 of what do you do in your free time?
So I do have a big family. I have 4 awesome children, so I try to spend as much time as possible with them and go to their events. In fact, tomorrow I'll be heading out of Seattle early to go see one of my son's championship volleyball game. And then the other thing I do, I like to exercise. So I like to do triathlons and ultra marathons. And it's a pretty selfish thing for me to do because it takes time away from, you know, my beautiful family and wife. But they let me because they know it's something I love. But yeah, that's what I do on the side.
So should we expect that, okay, for the next Spinnaker Summit, number one is one of the days we will have a early morning run.
That'd be great.
And second would be daycare.
Yes, yeah. Daycare and a run, maybe even a swim and a bike too. But yeah.
And maybe a binge watching for kids Stranger Things. Season 3. Thank you so much, Andy, for talking today. And
thank you.
Of course, we'll see you again at the next event. And
Can't wait.
Good luck with the project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we make a series for Netflix? That would be cool.